What's going on, Chess YouTube? In today's video, we are looking at the game Hans Niemann versus Gukesh D from the 2023 London Chess Classic. Now, this was just a really spectacular game by the future world champion, and I gotta say, Gukesh D also played very, very well. I mean, Gukesh just launched his G-pawn down the board, and from there, the game was nuts. Gukesh was doing everything he could to checkmate Hans Niemann, while the bad boy of chess was trying to counterattack in the center and on the queen side without getting checkmated. So bottom line, if you love Hans Niemann, Gukesh, or you just want to see some crazy attacking chess, this is the video for you. Make sure you stick around for the finale. The finish to this game was just unbelievable. Okay, in the game, Hans Niemann was white. He opened 1e4, Gukesh responds e5, and very quickly we get the Italian game on the board with 3 bishop c4. Okay, from here, both sides follow the main line, and we get this position where black does have a choice. Do you want to go a6 or a5? In the game, Gukesh goes a6. The idea of this move is you're simply creating a retreat square on a7 for the bishop, and overall, your pawn structure is very, very compact. It's a very safe and solid way to play the Italian as black. Of course, the alternative here on move 6 is the move a5. This move is also very, very popular. A ton of grandmasters like Wesley So are big fans of it. However, it is more dangerous for black if you don't know what you're doing, so a6 was a very solid choice by Gukesh. Now again, both sides have a lot of different ideas. Hans goes for this modern idea of a4, gaining space on the queen side. And here is where we have the first big branching point of the game. Now, in this position, Hans Niemann has a ton of different options as white. For example, you can immediately gain space on the queen side with the move b4. You can also start rerouting that knight on the b2 square with the maneuver knight d2 to f1 and then g3. And from g3, the knight supports the pawn on e4 and that d3 to d4 break in the center. However, Hans Niemann had a different idea in mind for this game. He doesn't do any of those standard ideas. Instead, what he does is he launches the a-pawn down the board to a5. Arnold Schwarzenegger, the a-pawn, has entered the game. Now, what's the idea behind this move a5? Well, first of all, Hans Niemann is a big fan of this idea in the Italian. I mean, he recently played a blitz game against Magnus Carlsen where he launched the a-pawn all the way down to a6 in the Italian. It was very, very strange. However, there is an idea behind this. White is just gaining space on the queen side and kind of clamping down on black's future ideas of b6 or b5. I mean, if black ever does that, Hans Niemann is going to recapture a takes b6 and potentially damage black's pawn structure. And beyond that, there are some other ideas that a5 does give white. I mean, he now has access to that a4 square for both the rook and the queen. And I don't want to give too much away, but that a4 square does become absolutely critical later in the game, and it might even be Hans Niemann's key defensive resource. Hint, hint, wink, wink. So make sure you stick around to see a potential rook lift on the 4th rank to save the game. Of course, this move is not all rainbows and sunshine. There is one big, and I mean big, drawback of this move. And before I explain what it is, let's have a look at what Gukesh D does in this position. Well, as promised, Gukesh D launches his G-pawn down the board, plays the move G5, and he starts his kingside attack. Now, if you follow top-level chess, then you know this idea of G5 is just insanely popular in the Italian game. The idea is Gukesh wants to go G4, kicking that knight off the wonderful F3 square, then follow up with H4 and H3, and maybe even G3 in the future, trying to blow open that kingside. And as you can see, that bishop on a7 is just perfectly placed to spearhead an attack on the king. But here's the real question. Why did Gukesh play this idea on move 9 after a4 to a5? Here's the idea. Let's say instead of a5, Hans Niemann just went for b4, gaining space on the queen side. Now, if Gukesh went g5, at any point in the future, Hans Niemann could play the very aggressive idea of b5. What's the idea? Well, now Hans Niemann is blowing open the queen side, which makes it very, very difficult for him to castle on the queen side in the future. I mean, here, if that was the case, Hans Niemann's attack is already so much faster. However, here's the real difference. After a5 from Hans Niemann, a5 on the board, Now, when Gukesh went g5, suddenly Hans Niemann doesn't have that idea of b5. If he goes b4, then followed by b5 in the future, let's say knight h7, then b5 on the board, now Gukesh can take the pawn, and Hans Niemann's attack is destroyed. To keep the attack going, he had to recapture with the a pawn on a4, then a takes b5 is strong. But in this position, Hans Niemann's pawn structure is destroyed, and black is just better. So that is the key idea. Gukesh waited for a5 from Hans Niemann, which destroys the idea of b4 to b5, and then he says, oh, wait a minute, now is the perfect time to strike g5. Here we go. It is on Hans Niemann. Okay, now what does Hans do? He starts bishop e3. Fantastic idea. Simply challenging that bishop on a7. I mean, if Hans does not do this sooner or later, that bishop is going to be a monster, and the idea of g4, h4, and then g3 is going to be insane. So Hans demonstrating his sagacity or the ability to perceive. Excellent choice. But Gukesh, he is not letting up. g4 on the board. He wants to attack. Oh boy, it's only move 10. Things are already getting spicy. All right, Hans retreats. Knight f to d2. Now Gukesh takes on e3. The idea of this move, if Gukesh waits, let's say if he plays the move h4, then Hans could take on a7. And here Gukesh is a very difficult choice. You either take back with the rook and lose the idea of long castling in the future, and that could be a very, very important resource later on. Or you take back with the knight, but then that knight is simply further away from the game. So instead of waiting for that when either recapture on a7 is problematic, Gukesh just takes the bishop on e3 right away. Bang, bishop takes e3. Now, believe it or not, Hans Niemann actually has a big choice here. Do you recapture with the f-pawn or with the rook? Now, most players would immediately recapture with the rook in this position. Rook takes e3, but Hans Niemann, let me tell you, he is not most players. In this position, he recaptures with the pawn. F takes e3. What is the idea? Well, normally in chess, you do not want double pawns. That is typically a weakness. However, in this position, those double pawns do give Hans Niemann some benefits. The first idea, obviously, that pawn on e3 does a wonderful job of controlling the central squares on d4 and f4. I mean, that f4 square in particular is going to be essential to control. At some point in the future, Gukesh could get a knight reroute from h5 to f4, and that would be incredibly scary for Hans. So that pawn on e3 does a fantastic job of guarding that f4 square. However, just as importantly, the move f takes e3 opens up the f-file for the rook. Now Hans could play rook f1 or even queen e2 to f2 in the future and just start piling up the pressure on that open f-file. I mean, you could just imagine the rook and the queen and the bishop all lining up on that f7 square in the future. Okay, enough chit-chat. F takes e3 on the board. Now, Gukesh. At this point, he is basically all in on the attack. There is no going back. You have to go for it. But the big question is, how do you continue the attack? Now, in the game, Gukesh played the move knight to h7. And I gotta say, I am not a huge fan of this move. I mean, it's not really clear what it's accomplishing. Now, in the Italian, there are sometimes lines where you go knight h7, then f8, then to the g6 square, and then finally onto the f4 square. And from f4, that knight is an absolute monster. However, in this position, that pawn on e3 does cover f4, which makes this whole idea of the knight reroute a little bit less attractive. And in case you're wondering, that knight reroute is also often a good idea when there's a bishop on the g3 square, but that is simply not the case in this position. So what should he have played instead? Well, the best move here is actually simply h5. I mean, this move looks logical enough. You just continue that kingside pawn storm. And then from there, let's say Hans Niemann plays rook f1, very logical move. Then you just go h4, and these pawns are perfectly defended. And from here, it looks like Gukesh has a pretty significant edge. I mean, Hans Niemann is not necessarily out of the game yet, but Gukesh definitely has the initiative here. Okay, instead of that, knight to h7 on the board from Gukesh. And now Hans Niemann, knight to f1. I'm not so sure about this move. The idea is he wants to go knight to g3. However, it does take away the f1 square for the rook, and that was kind of the whole point of f takes e3. So instead of that, simply rook f1 may have been the better choice. But regardless, knight f1 on the board, and now Gukesh strikes with the key idea h5. Here we go. We've got a game. All right, Hans, knight g3, getting the knight into the game and eyeing f5. That is going to be a crucial square. But now Gukesh, queen g5. a5, the queen enters the game. Oh boy, now both players improve the placement of their queenside knights. Hans goes knight to d2, Gukesh knight to e7. I mean, both players clearly understand that kingside is where the action is. They're just trying to get all their pieces over there as fast as possible. And real fast, that knight on e7 is a critical piece for Gukesh. It guards the f5 square, preventing knight f5 ideas from Hans. Now, Hans Niemann, he has a very important decision to make. This is an absolutely critical point in the game. At this point, if he simply waits around and defends passively, he's going to be in a world of trouble. And for that reason, he needs to counterattack in the center or on the queen side right now. And this is where Hans Niemann shows why he's my #1 favorite player. This guy is so aggressive and so creative. In this position, he finds the incredible move. Queen to a4 check, hitting the king. Oh boy, what is the idea of this move? Well, believe it or not, there is no easy way for Gukesh to get out of the check. I mean, if you simply block the check, bishop d7, then queen b4, hitting that undefended b7 pawn is very strong. Okay, let's run through the ideas real fast for Gukesh. First of all, if you go bishop d7 trying to block the queen, that looks like the most logical move. However, it is a blunder because Hans has the idea bishop takes f7. Oh my goodness, the deflection. If king takes, queen takes d7, the bishop is unprotected. And just look at that king position. Hans is going to go rook to f1, and suddenly it's a good old-fashioned Gukesh king hunt. Okay, bishop d7 is no good. What about knight to c6? Well, that move completely defeats the purpose of going knight to e7, blocking the f5 square. Hans Niemann can go rook f1 and then knight to f5 next with a great position. Okay, bishop d7 and knight c6 are no good. Here, the computer actually thinks the best move is the unthinkable move, king to d8. Now, what's the idea behind this move? Well, you sacrifice the pawn on f7, but the computer seems to think it doesn't really matter. I mean, you just go rook f8, hitting the bishop, white has to defend, then you go h4, and you just continue with the attack. And it looks kind of insane to attack without that rook ever being into the game, but the computer seems to like this for black. So king d8 was the best, but simply an unthinkable, inhuman move. Or as I like to say, a Hans Niemann move, but Gukesh did not play that. Instead, he plays the next best option, that is c6, blocking the check. However, Hans Niemann is not done with the queen. He responds queen to b4, and now he's hitting that d6 pawn that is now undefended. Of course, the pawn on c7 was defending it before, but that is no longer the case. Now here, Gukesh shows why he might be the next world champion. He understands you cannot simply sit back and defend in this kind of position. You have to go forward and attack, and that is exactly what he does. He launches the attack with the move h4, hitting the knight. Now, Hans Niemann is virtually forced to jump forward with the knight to f5. And here Gukesh takes with the bishop, Hans takes back, and then he strikes in the center with the move d5. This, of course, is part of the idea behind c6 a few moves earlier. Now, Hans, what do you do? The obvious idea is retreating the bishop, and that is what he does in the game. He goes bishop b3. Of course, bishop a2 is also good, and Hans even has the idea of queen takes b7, the intermediate move. Instead of guarding the bishop on c4, you simply take the pawn on b7, and now the rook on a8 is undefended. If Gukesh takes the bishop, Hans would take the rook, and that is effectively game over. So instead of that, Gukesh would have to castle here, indirectly defending the rook on a8. And now Hans retreats the bishop, and surprisingly, the queen is not trapped yet. So this would have been a very interesting idea for Hans Niemann, but not completely necessary either. Instead, bishop b3 on the board. And now, Gukesh, what do you do about your king and that pawn on b7? In the game, he castles kingside, and this move, to me, looks so strange. I mean, you spent all that time gaining an attack on the king side, and then you throw your king there and undevelop the rooks. The rook was more active on the HA square. Instead, the best move here was simply long castles. And normally, you do not want your king over here with the queen on b4, the pawn on a5. However, it's not so clear how white is going to develop the attack. I mean, that idea of the pawn break b5 is no longer as good with the pawn on a5, where it can't support the b5 pawn. And funnily enough, that king on c8 defends the b7 pawn perfectly, so this would have been the best move, and Gukesh from there could just launch his pawns down the board and continue the attack. But instead, castles kingside on the board. And now Hans Niemann has the unbelievable idea, yes, the idea I alluded to earlier in the intro, and that is the move rook to a4, and freeing up the a4 square for the queen and then the rook. Now the queen and the rook are slicing through the 4th rank, hitting that pawn on g4, and Hans Niemann may have stopped Gukesh's attack once and for all. Wow, okay, Gukesh, he goes for it, g3, but now Hans Niemann takes on h4, the queens come off the board, and the pawns come off. And now after f6, we finally have a complicated queenless middle game position. I mean, Hans Niemann went from facing a dangerous attack to being up a pawn in the endgame. It's amazing how fast he turned that around with the idea of rook to a4. Now from here, both sides start to regroup, and Hans Niemann breaks in the center with the insane idea d4. Oh boy, we have the pawn square in the middle of the board. Whenever you have a pawn square, all the pawns hitting each other, you know shit is about to go down. So what happens? Gukesh takes in the center, then Hans takes the other pawn. And now Hans rook h6, activating the other rook. On that 6th rank, Hans Niemann just systematically taking over the game. Okay, both players bring their kings in, and here Gukesh makes a fatal mistake. He plays the move rook a to g8. Now, if you like puzzles, go ahead and pause the video right now, because there is a beautiful finish to this position. I'm talking Sofia Vergara level beauty here. It is unbelievable. And I'll give you one hint. It has to do with this bishop on b3 slicing through to the rook on g8. Okay, did you find the idea? Well, here it is. Here, Hans Niemann goes c4, hitting the knight. The knight goes back, and then c5. Here we go. What's the problem? What's the problem? It's check, hitting the king and the rook with the x-ray. You have to go knight d5 blocking. But here, Hans Niemann delivers the final blow of the game. You play bishop takes d5, and then knight to e6. And in this position, Gukesh resigned. He left the game. That is it. No mas, no more. Here's the idea. Well, first of all, what if you just move the rook? The only square is h7. Then you take the knight with check, and no matter how black recaptures, let's say f takes, then you just take the rook on h7, followed by the pawn on b7, and that is all she wrote. On the other hand, if you take the knight on e6, then you go rook takes e6. And first of all, Hans Niemann threatens mate in 1 with the move rook h takes f6. And if Gukesh tries to defend, I don't know, rook here, and you just take the rook. And on the other hand, if you go something like rook to anywhere else, even there, this is just ugly. Rook takes and white is in complete control. Wow, what a game by Hans Niemann.